Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Black Orchestra, a World War II spy thriller, by J. Toner. Narrated by Gildart Jackson. Völkische Beobachter, 18th of October 1939. U-47 sinks British battleship. At anchor. In the early hours of October the 14th, 1939, the impregnable defences at the British naval base at Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands were breached by U-47, a U-boat of the Third Reich. Commanded by Korvettenkapitän Gunther Prien, U-47 successfully completed a difficult and daring manoeuvre to slip past the blockade ships on the eastern approaches and into the vast harbour. There they found the battleship Royal Oak at anchor and completely unaware of the approaching danger. With stealth and precision, the crew of U-47 loaded their torpedo tubes, and the captain gave the order to fire. 3 minutes later the crew heard a series of monumental explosions, and they knew that their mission was a success. The giant battleship HMS Royal Oak was sinking, and behind it the battlecruiser Repulse was also fatally damaged. U-47 made its escape successfully and returned to base at Wilhelmshaven. Today, October the 18th, the whole crew of the submarine was flown to Berlin to be welcomed home by the Führer himself. At 11 a.m., Korvettenkapitän Gunther Prien and his crew arrived at Tempelhof Airport in 3 aircraft. Wearing his Iron Cross and his newly awarded Knight's Cross, Kapitän Prien was carried in an open car through the streets of the city to the Reichschancellery. There he dismounted. Accompanied by U-Bootwaffe Commander-in-Chief Admiral Karl Dönitz, he paused on the Chancellery steps to acknowledge the cheering crowds before entering the building. Part 1. Chapter 1. March 1940. When the war started, I was living in Berlin, working as a signalman in the headquarters of the Abwehr. I lived alone. My father had died 5 years earlier, and my mother moved abroad 3 years after that. With the advent of hostilities, all normal life ceased, and I lost contact with my mother. The daily tedium of office hours was replaced by the unrelenting pressure of shift work, with nothing to occupy my thoughts but the continuous merry-go-round of work and sleep, until the Friday evening, when I discovered Tristan Kleister's body. Kriminalinspektor Glaser of the Berlin Kripo was the thinnest man I had ever seen. Cheekbones as sharp as blades underlined his sunken eyes. His fingers rested on the table in front of him, 2 bundles of knuckle and bone barely held together with skin. "You are Kurt Muller?" "I am." "You discovered the body?" I was still shaking from shock. I tried to compose myself. "Yes, this evening when I came on shift, I signed in at 7:40, allowing 10 minutes to climb 4 flights of stairs." Sitting to Glaser's right, my supervisor, Drobel the cripple, chipped in. Muller's shift started at 8. The room was small and bare. A table, 3 chairs, a barred window. On the table nothing but a black telephone. The fingers of Glaser's right hand began to drum on the edge of the table like a piano player running up and down the scales. "Tell me what you saw." Kleister was lying on the bench in front of the radio transmitter at Station 5. There was a small hole in his head. "Here," I pointed, "just behind his headphones." I had seen black brain matter on the desk, but very little blood. My stomach heaved at the memory. "And the gun?" The fingers paused. "In his hand." There had been a stench of cordite. "Did you touch anything? The body, the gun, perhaps?" Glaser was dressed in a dark blue gabardine overcoat and still wore his hat, a Homburg. He looked like a man with an urgent appointment elsewhere. He pushed his hat brim back and leaned forward, placing the points of his elbows carefully on the table. "How well did you know this man?" I writhed under the intense glare of the two men facing me. Surely they couldn't suspect that I had something to do with Clyster's death. "Not well. We had a nodding acquaintance. Clyster and I both worked in the communications unit. In truth, I barely knew him, but we spent a few of our short breaks together." Drobel piped in again. "We work a strict 8-day rota, around-the-clock 8-hour shifts with 24 hours between. The rota ensures that there are always 4 men on duty." What our harsh and pitiless supervisor had failed to mention was the double shift, 16 hours of intense concentration with 4 short breaks, that each man had to work every 10 periods. The work was tough, the hours brutal. Glasser turned to Drobel. "Ah, were there 4 men on duty during Clyster's shift?" "There was very little incoming traffic today," Drobel said. "I sent 3 of the men home early." That was a first. "So Clyster was alone?" "Yes." Glasser turned back to me. "You spent some of these in Clyster's company?" "Yes, up until last week when our shifts diverged." The signalmen were a miserable lot mostly. Many were men who had won their postings in Berlin by political influence. They came and went on the clock, and I imagined them at home in their spare time kicking their dogs or beating their wives. At work hardly a kind word was exchanged. Clyster was one of the few colleagues that I managed to become acquainted with when our shifts coincided for one whole 8-day rota. "What did you talk about?" "Nothing, really. He was from Saxony. I think he said his father worked in aircraft maintenance with the Luftwaffe. Clyster and I did exchange personal histories. I'm sure he said his mother died recently, and he mentioned a sister." "Is there anything else? Did he seem depressed, unhappy about anything?" "I couldn't say." "So you've no idea why he might have killed himself?" When I resumed my duties, everything had returned to normal in the communications unit. Clyster's body had been removed, and the desktop at Station 5 scrubbed clean. I resumed my duties. Concentration proved elusive, and I made more mistakes than usual that night. My mind kept returning to Clyster as I tried to imagine the depths of despair that would lead a young man to suicide. From what little I could recall of my conversations with Clyster, there had been no hint of the turmoil in his mind. As I signed out at the end of my shift, Siegfried, the night watchman, said, "Have you heard?" I liked Siegfried. He was ancient, arthritic, and diminutive, with skin like an elephant's and a chest covered in old war decorations. He always had the latest gossip and loved to share. "No, tell me." "There was another suicide. Another signalman, in the Leipzig office, about 36 hours ago. His name was Barnard. They say he was a Gestapo informer." The funeral was held on the following Monday evening. Clyster's father and sister were there. Drobel and I attended. The coffin was conveyed up a cobbled slope to the graveyard on a dilapidated horse-drawn cart. The horse was old, stumbling, suffering its burden. It raised its great head and stared at me for a moment. That large, lugubrious black eye seemed to blame me for the whole miserable affair. The burial plot had been dug outside the walls of the graveyard, in an area reserved for those guilty of taking their own lives, the most heinous crime in the eyes of the Roman Church. When the interment was over, Clyster's father shook my hand with a questioning look. "Thomas Clyster?" "Kurt Muller. I'm sorry for your loss, sir." Clyster's sister, Frau Tanja Schäfer, wore a veil that obscured her face. When I approached her, she lifted the veil to reveal dark, intense eyes. I expected tears, but her face was set in a grim expression which I read as anger. "You knew my brother, Herr Muller." Her voice was husky from tears. Did you think him suicidal?" The next morning, at the end of my shift, I spoke to the night watchman again. "Did you hear the shot, Siegfried?" "No, sir." "And who was in the building at the time?" Siegfried, together with his daytime counterpart Sigmund the doorman, was responsible for ensuring that every person entering and leaving the building signed the daily log. "Only Drobel, the cripple. Here, see for yourself, sir." He thrust the logbook under my nose. I checked it for Thursday evening. As Siegfried had said, everyone that had checked into the building that morning had checked out again by 7:30 p.m. Everyone, that is, except our supervisor, Drobel, the troll. I examined the log more carefully. Oberst Krause, the head of Section 3, the domestic intelligence unit, had signed in at midday. When I pointed this out to Siegfried, he peered at the page. "He returned from Leipzig that day," he said, flexing his fingers. "And where was Oberst Schiller? I don't see his name anywhere." "Oberst Bernhard Schiller was head of my section, Section 1, Technical and Signals." Siegfried's head bobbed up and down. "Both Obersts were in Leipzig. Oberst Schiller returned on Friday." "You told all this to the Kripo man?" "He didn't ask." "And did he look at these records?" "Not any time that I was on duty, sir, but you'd need to check with Sigmund." Chapter 2. March 1940. A couple of days after Kleister's funeral, I met my one friend, Alex Clausen, for lunch at an open-air café on Unter den Linden. Alex worked in the Air Ministry in a role similar to mine. He was a year younger than me, somewhat portly, with a bulbous nose and a God-given talent for making people laugh. We shared an interest in Wagnerian opera. While we waited for our food, I told Alex about Kleister. His first reaction was a string of profanities. Finally he said, "The gun was in his right hand?" "Yes." "And was he right-handed?" "That's not the point." "The wound was in the back of his skull, you say?" "Yes, back about here, behind his headphones." I pointed to Alex's skull, high above and behind his right ear. "You think he couldn't have shot himself?" "I suppose it's possible, maybe with his thumb on the trigger, but why reach all the way round there? And why would he have left his headphones on?" He pondered the problem for a minute or two. To me, then, Berlin was the most vibrant city in the world, and Unter den Linden its jewel. The street was packed with pedestrians, many in uniform, everyone in high good humour. The sparrows were everywhere, picking up crumbs from the tables, several bloated wood-pigeons amongst them, trying to blend in. "So you think someone shot him?" Alex said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm certain of it." "Your supervisor, this Drobel?" "There was no one else in the building." He gave a low whistle. "If you had arrived a few minutes earlier, you might have seen it happen. Or it could have been you. Fucking hell, Kurt, I bet you crapped in your pants." "Not quite," I grimaced, "but I lost my breakfast." "Why would anyone want to shoot this Kleister?" I looked around. We were surrounded on all sides by office workers and Wehrmacht soldiers having their lunch. No one seemed interested in us. I lowered my voice. "I don't know." These were perilous times. People disappeared or turned up dead every day. Alex knew this as well as I did. The food arrived, served by a middle-aged woman in a grubby apron. The conversation died while we ate. For Alex, eating was a no-holds-barred occupation of unbounded pleasure. He seemed to try to involve as many of his senses as he could. He leaned over his plate, shoveling sauerkraut and sausage into his mouth with little grunts of pleasure. "It could all be over in a month," he said, wiping his mouth. The war was progressing well. Austria, Poland, and Czechoslovakia had been annexed, and a non-aggression treaty signed with the Soviet Union. "Or 2 at the most," I replied. "I may be able to go back to Ireland after all." We'd spoken before about my ambition to go back to Trinity College in Dublin to resume my studies, an ambition frustrated by the advent of the war. "Why did you have to go to Ireland to study? Aren't there any good universities in the fatherland?" he said. A tram rattled by. I had to wait for it to pass before replying. "I told you my mother's Irish." "Ah, yes, I remember." He tilted his head, closed one eye, and stuck his tongue out. This was his Hunchback of Notre Dame, one of his favourite comic poses. "Your parents met at a youth rally in Munich." "They met at a youth hostel in Munich," I laughed. There were no youth rallies in those days. Alex was never forthcoming about his own family. Like me, his father had died young. His mother lived in the north, near Hamburg. He had told me in an unguarded moment that he had a younger brother called Eugen. "What's your interest in this clyster?" he said. As always, there was a small portion left on his plate, a pleasure postponed. "I believe the police have closed the case. They've come to the wrong conclusion. And poor Clyster's been buried on the wrong side of the graveyard wall. There could be a killer on the loose." "You mean some maniac who wandered in off the street?" "No, the night watchman stands guard at the door. I mean someone in the Abwehr." "Your supervisor, the cripple?" "He's certainly vicious enough," I said, half-joking. "He'd shoot his own grandmother if there was profit in it." He waited until my plate was empty before polishing off the last of his sauerkraut and sausage, washed down with the final mouthful of beer. We walked back a short distance together. Before we parted, Alex said, "Have you spoken to anyone else about your suspicions?" "Not yet." "Well, don't. Take my advice and drop the whole thing." Signing in for a day shift a week later, I asked Sigmund if the creepo man had asked to see his daily log for the day when Clyster died. Sigmund the doorman was just as old as his counterpart, Siegfried. Like the night watchman, he had served with distinction in the previous war, with a row of medals on his chest to prove it. He shook his head. "I must say I was surprised. I mean, what's the fucking point of keeping these fucking records if they're never consulted?" I decided to go over Drobo's head and take my concerns to the head of my section, Oberst Bernhard Schiller. I thought it unlikely that the Oberst would grant an audience to a lowly signalman, but much to my surprise, I was summoned to his office. Behind his desk stood 2 swastika standards. The impression was one of busy clutter, accentuated by the presence of several bronze objects littering the desk, an eagle in flight, a miniature Brandenburg gate on a marble stand, and another eagle peering down at a nest of broken eggs. This piece I recognized, for my late father had had one just like it. The Oberst was dressed in a plain blue suit. He was a large man in his 50s, very pale, smoking a long Russian cigarette. I outlined my concerns about Clyster's death. When I stopped to draw breath, the Oberst said, "What are you suggesting?" "I believe Clyster was murdered, Herr Oberst." "This is preposterous," he snapped. "The police have investigated these matters, have they not? You and I are not qualified for police work. We must leave these matters to the experts. If you wish to continue to work in the Abwehr, please just attend to your duties. Concentrate your energies on the signals. Do you hear?" "Herr Oberst," I said, "I only ask that you examine the evidence yourself. I'm sure you'll be convinced, as I am." "Forget this nonsense, Muller. That's an order. Do your duty. Nothing more is required of you." So there it was. Everybody seemed satisfied that Clyster blew his own brains out. The Oberst was right. It was useless, my speculating on Clyster's death. I needed to go back to work and devote all my attention to my duties as a signalman. There was a war to be fought. Chapter 3. April 1940. On a warm Sunday in April, I was summoned to a garden party at my uncle's house on the northern outskirts of Berlin. His staff addressed him as SS Gruppenführer Heydrich. To me, he was Uncle Reinhardt. The occasion marked Uncle Reinhardt's recent appointment as head of the newly constituted Reich Security Headquarters, the RSHA. After years of interdepartmental strife, he had succeeded in uniting under his command all four of the Reich's security organizations: Orpo, the uniformed police; Kripo, the criminal police; Gestapo, the secret state police; and Sicherheitsdienst, SD, the elite security service of the SS. Placing a glass of schnapps in my hand, he steered me to a secluded corner of the garden. He was much as I remembered him, a tall, thin man in a dark suit with an egg-shaped head and small eyes. "I hear you've been causing a storm in the Abwehr," he said. Instantly there was an uncomfortable feeling in the pit of my stomach, accompanied by a mental image of men in senior positions in government and the military sitting around gossiping like housewives. Before joining the Abwehr, it had been made plain to me that the lines between the Abwehr and the RSHA must never be breached, and besides, my instinct told me that any information given to my uncle would be used against the Abwehr. "It was nothing," I replied. "The suicide of a colleague is hardly nothing, Kurt. How well did you know him?" I felt a sharp pain, as if something had twisted in my stomach. The subject was dynamite. I could say nothing. "Not well." Uncle Reinhardt nodded. "How do you like the work?" I was relieved he'd moved on. It seemed he'd been fully briefed on my meeting with Oberst Schiller and needed no more from me on the subject. I drew myself up. "I intend to enlist at the earliest opportunity." "You feel that you could do more for your country as a soldier?" I thought the Kriegsmarine, the glamour of the Navy, had never been far from my mind since the start of the war. There were so few Berliners of my age not in uniform that I often attracted second glances from people in the street. The feeling of guilt was ever present, like a festering sore. Besides, I felt that my recent confrontation with the Oberst might have soured my career prospects. Uncle Reinhardt's knowledge about that did nothing to assuage my concern. He gave a thin smile. "Nonsense, Kurt. You are serving your country with distinction, I'm sure. Your language skills must be a great asset to the Abwehr." "I have English only, and everything I do is with Morse code, transmitting or recording." His pencil eyebrows seemed to register mild surprise. In matters of personal grooming, Uncle Reinhardt was a paragon. His chin was shaved like porcelain, his eyebrows plucked thin and streamlined as blades, and there was no vestige of nasal hair to be seen in his long, narrow nose. He continued, "The war with the British will be a short-lived affair. Our non-aggression pact with the Soviets will ensure a quick and decisive victory. Germany is awake again after its long slumber. Germany, the new fatherland, will put behind it the injustices of the last war and rise from the ashes." "Yes, Uncle." "You should be proud, Kurt. Be proud of your achievements. I never had the opportunity to go to university. You were fortunate. You, and millions like you, will form the backbone of the new Germany. Intelligent, educated visionaries." I murmured something. "How long since we've spoken?" he asked. "At my father's funeral 5 years ago." The hearse was gleaming black, with large wheels and glass panels on either side, drawn by 2 high-stepping black geldings, and driven by a tall man wearing a morning suit and top hat. At the graveside 3 more strangers appeared, and the 4 men lifted the coffin from the hearse. It was a beautiful July day. Mother, leaning heavily on my arm, wore a full-length black coat, her face obscured by a veil. The pastor read from his prayer book, some Lutheran mumbo-jumbo. His words may have been a comfort to my mother, but they meant nothing to me. I could make no sense of what had happened. I was angry, and I wanted to strike back at the world for the senseless way that my father had been taken from us. "Kurt?" "I'm sorry, Uncle. What did you say?" I said I was saddened at his tragic passing. Your father and I were good friends. He was a man of substance and a true patriot. Yes, uncle. Bizarrely he changed subject in midstream. What of the IRA? Did you come into contact with them while you were in Ireland? No, I never met anyone from the IRA. And what of the Irish people, Kurt? Of course they hate the British. The Irish have been under the British jackboot for centuries. You must have seen their hatred of the British. I shook my head. His upper lip curled in a vestige of scorn. You must have led a sheltered life in Ireland. It seems your head was buried in your books and you failed to see what was going on around you. The university had been a sheltered environment, but I had spent 2 of my 4 undergraduate years living in digs in the city. I had never seen any signs of strong anti-British feelings, nor heard any mention of the IRA. I had seen crushing unemployment and extreme poverty in Ireland. I had seen workhouses and prisons overflowing and hungry children. Perhaps what I had seen in people's faces was hatred, but it seemed more like anger and despair to me. And I had seen all of these things in Germany too, lives destroyed by the depression that followed the Great War. Uncle Reinhard was seized upon and carried away by his people, murmuring in his ears. As I stood alone wondering which of my uncle's devious plans I had been sucked into, a tall girl approached. She had dark, shoulder-length hair. Her face was shaded by a wide-brimmed hat. A light blue summer dress, cut fashionably short, accentuated her full breasts, wide hips. I thought she would float past me, but she presented me with the back of her hand and said, "Gudrun von Sommerfeld, you look as bored as I feel." I grasped her hand and clicked my heels. "Kurt Muller, enchanted, Fräulein." She laughed and withdrew her hand. "You're related to Reinhard, I believe." "He's my uncle," I replied. "Well, he's not actually my uncle," I was babbling. "So he is your uncle, but he isn't your uncle. I'm glad we cleared that up. Herr Heydrich's sister, Edeltraud, is married to my father's brother." My first impression was that she was older than me, although I thought she had probably picked me out of the crowd because I was the only person in the garden anywhere close to her own age. I stood with my arms crossed, clutching my empty schnapps glass to my chest. I was wearing my only suit, the one I used for work, an ill-fitting, threadbare garment of light wool in navy blue, well past its best. There was a small stain on my lapel. She held no glass, and I was debating whether or not to suggest remedying this situation when she produced a cigarette from her purse and lit it with a match. "You work with your uncle?" She squinted in the early evening sun, her large earrings shaped like crescent moons, flashing reflected sunlight in my eyes. "No, Fräulein, I'm with the Abwehr." "Ah, Admiral Canaris, a distinguished man, but short and thin." I've never actually met him. This was true, although I had seen him on a few occasions. He was indeed a distinguished-looking man, not tall, certainly, but I thought he was not as thin as I was. "Reinhard tells me you are an only child, and your mother lives in Ireland." So she knew something of me from discussions with Uncle Reinhard. I said, "And what's your connection to my uncle, Fräulein?" She replied only with a fleeting smile. I was uncomfortable with this. It told me nothing while suggesting some secret close relationship, professional or personal. So what if it was a secret? She could just as easily have given me a vague answer or told me a lie. Her answer was like a slap in the face. After that encounter, I replayed our conversation in my mind many times. In the reruns, my responses were wittier, my smile more assured, and she melted into my arms every time. Chapter 4. April 1940. Days later, Drawbell called me into his office, a converted walk-in closet at the end of the corridor, to take a telephone call. Oberst Schiller, our section head.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?